Do you need to remove the shifter and the shifter plate from your tracker bass boat? I'm going to show you how. Stick around. Hey folks, Keith here, Chicken Thigh Fishing. Well, I'll tell you what, trying to find information about properly removing the shifter and the shifter plate from your tracker bass boat is like finding a leprechaun. So I finally figured it out. I'm going to share it with you. So if for any reason you have to remove your shifter and the plate to get to your shifter box in your tracker bass boat, this ought to help you out. So my boat is a 2021 Tracker Pro Team 175 TXW, and I'm telling you, I looked everywhere trying to figure out how to get my shifter off and more importantly the shifter plate behind it so I could get into that area behind there. The reason I had to do that was because I had a short that I was able to trace back to that area, and so I had to get in there to examine that and hopefully fix the short. Now I imagine there's 100 other reasons you might have to get into your shifter area, but I couldn't find any information anywhere. I got together with a buddy of mine, we put our heads together, we figured it out. Well, we figured out one way to do it, so I'm going to share that with you. And so if you need to get your shifter off and get that plate off and get in the back there, do any work on the cables, the wires, the shifter box, anything like that, this will show you how to do that. Now, removing the shifter is fairly easy. All you have to do to remove that shifter is pop out this button here, and once you get that button out, there's an 11/16 nut way in there that holds the shifter onto the, I guess for lack of a better term, the gear shaft for the shifting box. And all you have to do is remove that button, get in there on that bolt and pull that out, and then you can remove the shifter. No problem, right? Well, once you remove that shifter, you'll see that the shifter box blocks the access into this area. It's like when you remove that shifter, there's not just a void you can reach into and work on. There's a shifter box there. So you have to detach the shifter from the shifter box, and there are two plates here. There is an outer plate, this plate here, and then there's this big, the back plate, and that's what I wanted to get off there so I could get in there, because when I look at the size of it, I figure there's a pretty big void back there to be able to do the work I need to do and check my short out and fix the wiring and whatnot. Man, it wasn't that easy. When I looked at this for the first time, I saw a series of screws along the perimeter of this big plate here. 1, 2, 3, 4, you got 5, 6 up top here, and then you got 3 on this end. So I figured you take out those screws, take off the plate, right? Wrong. You can take off these 3 screws on this end, and you can take off these 2 screws on this end. But the 4 screws, the 2 upper, 1, 2, and the 2 lower down here that are immediately around the shifter itself, you can't take those screws out. You know why you can't take those screws out? Because they ain't screws, they're bolts. That's right. They are bolted through the shifting plate and through the cowling, and back here, underneath here on the other side of this cowling, they are secured with nuts. Why is that a problem? Problem is because your boat's in the way. This comes right up to the hull and the rail of your boat, and you have to get back there behind this piece of cowling in order to get a wrench or a socket onto those nuts in order to remove these 4 bolts. And until you do that, you cannot remove that plate. So therein lies the challenge to this job. How do you get behind there? Well, here we go. So when looking for areas to loosen up this whole cowling, I originally thought I was going to have to remove the whole instrument panel and the whole dash here. It turned out that wasn't the case. I started to do that, but then I started to find some areas where I could loosen this up. The first place is, if you take a look inside your starboard rod locker, there will be 2 bolts inside here, and they are behind this rod bracket here, and you can see the 2 bolts in there. Now you can certainly access those 2 bolts with this bracket in place, but it makes it a lot easier to get to them without struggling if you simply remove this, and that is a simple matter of removing 2 screws. The bracket is secured with a deck screw here and a deck screw here, so it's only 2 screws to get that out of your way. And then you can remove this bracket. So now you can see with that bracket removed, you have completely clear access to these 2 bolts here that go through to the other side. Those 2 bolts go through that back wall of that rod locker compartment, and they go through an aluminum plate, and they're attached with nuts on the other side, which is underneath your driver's console. So in order to access those, you have to remove this panel here that your fuse block is mounted to, and it is secured with 4 screws, 1 on each corner. And so now once you have that panel removed with your power block on it, you can see that you have clear access to the nuts on the other side of those 2 bolts. So other than the inconvenience of having to remove that panel that your fuse block is on, no big deal there. However, that is a 2-person job, because unless you have arms that are 10 feet long, you're not going to be able to secure the nut on one side underneath and then come all the way around and reach out here into your rod locker in order to unscrew those bolts. So you're going to need another person, either to be at the rod locker end or underneath the driver's console, one or the other, so you can get those 2 bolts out. So now that we have the front of the console, that cowling, loosened up, the next thing we have to remove in order to be able to move that whole console to get ourselves enough clearance to reach the nuts we need to get to the back of it is we have to remove this side panel here. And now the reason we have to remove that side panel is because it is secured with screws in 2 locations into the cowling and then into the deck here. So you would be unable to move this cowling with this in place. So we're going to remove a deck screw that's here, a deck screw that's here, a 3rd one, and a 4th one. Now this panel has this appendage that comes over here, and it's actually not secured. It's just kind of in there like this. So after you remove those 4 screws, you should be able to pull this whole panel out. However, there's a little surprise here. And now I'm able to do this easily because I'm in the middle of my annual maintenance and project time and stuff like that. And as part of that, I remove my seats because I like to clean underneath my seats because it gets incredibly nasty under there, and the water gets trapped and it's moist and gross. So I take out my seats in the fall. But if you were to do this without removing your seats, now that I think about it, I think it would be very difficult to remove this panel with your seats in place. And that's for 2 reasons. Number 1, your seat comes right up here, you know, the side of your seat. So it would be very difficult to pull this out and then pull it out with the rest of the panel. But there is also another reason. Let me show you. What I also have removed from the boat as part of the process of removing my seats is this back seat panel here. And this back seat panel holds this bumper cushion, and your seats, the back of your seats, get screwed through this panel and then into this back panel here. But the reason why this may pose a problem too, if you don't have your seats out, is because, as you can see here, when I put this in place, and if that were secured in there, that's going to hold that tightly in there. And that's probably why it's not screwed in to begin with, because this panel holds that end in place and it fits nice and snug in there when you secure it down. And so that didn't initially dawn on me as being an issue, because it wasn't a consideration when I was trying to get behind that shifter plate and move that cowling. And it wasn't an issue because my seats are out. But as I look at it now, I realize that if you don't have your seats out, you're not going to be able to remove that side panel. And if you don't remove that panel, you can't move the cowling, and you can't get, therefore, behind the cowling and get to the nuts that you need to remove that shifter plate. So, as part of this project, you're going to necessarily have to take your seats out. And you can't only take one of them out, because that big long panel that you have to take out goes behind both seats. Now, I did do a video. I have a video here on the removal of the seats from your bass boat, specifically from this tracker. It's a very easy job. It's just a little bit tedious because you got to find where the screws are and take them out. And really, it's just a series of removing a bunch of screws is all it is, and you pull the seats out. But, number one, it'll be worth it if you achieve your goal of moving the cowling and getting behind there to remove the shifter plate, if that's what you have to do. Number two, it's a great piece of maintenance to do on your boat anyway that not everybody thinks about, because let me tell you something, it gets so dirty and nasty behind your seats, and it's good to get those seats out, get them cleaned, put them out in the sun, dry them out, because the back of them is wood. You know, you have all the vinyl of your seats, but they're on a wooden frame. Moisture gets trapped back there. When I take mine off, they are soaked to the bone. So I sit them out in the sun. I sit them in my basement for a good long time, let them dry out, and then put them back in. Now, you may be able somehow to get that side panel out with your seats in place, but I'm not sure I see a way that you can do that without really bending that panel up, and you probably don't want to do that. I mean, it is only thin aluminum, so sure, it's got bend to it. But anyway, there's that. So after I got those bolts out from the starboard rod locker that go through the cowling, and after I removed that side panel underneath the shifter, I thought I was home free in order to be able to rock this back and forth enough and move it and give it enough play in the back that I could get to those nuts that I needed to get to. Not quite. When I was moving it, I felt another point of that felt like it was secured, and it was right over here in the corner. When I moved this would move a bit, but it was still attached by something over here. And what I found was there was a self-drilling screw inside here going into the cowling. Now, when I took it out, it didn't match any of the hardware of the boat, so I don't know that was a factory installed screw. You know, somebody may have put that in when they did some work on the boat, because I have had a few aftermarket projects done on this boat that I did not do myself. So I'm guessing that's the case, but I'm not 100% sure on that. So once you remove the bolts from the rod locker and then the side panel here, if you still can't move it and you feel someplace that it feels like it's still secured, go ahead and check it out. So what I did was, you'll see that I removed the screws that hold on this panel here. And when I took this panel out, I shined a light in there, and straight away in there I could see the hex head of a bolt that was going into the side of the cowling and securing it. And so what I had to do to get at that was I removed my electronics mount here, and I was able to see, and between the vision I had up top and being able to reach in here, I was able to put a socket on that and pull that out. And again, it was just a small, maybe 1.25 inch self-drilling screw that was also holding that. I took that one screw out, bam, I could move this whole cowling, the whole thing. I could move it away from the rail of the boat and then get in back here where I needed to get. So now that we got that movement in the front of the cowling here, we have to be able to move the back of it. Now, in order to do that, I had to remove this panel here. And this panel is held down with 3 screws in the carpet that you have to find. And then you can just simply remove that once you have those screws out. You can see that I've already done that. Now mine is attached with a wire here, and the reason is because I have LED deck lights that I installed on the deck of my boat. So I'm just going to move that aside. Now here, what I discovered was there was a screw right down in here holding this cowling drilled down into the deck. So you can see the hole where that screw was in there. So I had to get in between these cables and extract that screw because this was pulled up tight here and it was screwed in. And so I just removed that screw, and that allows me to move the back end. And now here is the Holy Grail. Now we are able to move this whole cowling out, and you can see the nut there and the nut there, and you should be able to see 2 down below if the light can get in there at the correct angle. For those 2 lower bolts. So the bolt that goes in here has a nut there, the bolt that goes in here has a nut there, and the 2 lower bolts underneath the shifter have nuts on the other side here. And so therein lies the trick to getting that shifter plate off that cowling. You cannot do it without getting behind the cowling and getting to those nuts, because you have long 3.5, 4-inch bolts that go through the plate, through the cowling, and they're nutted on the other side. So that's why it's so difficult to get that plate off. So now that we have access to that, simple job. Take those nuts and bolts off, and we're going to get access. And you can see that I have plenty of space to access those now. Man, they make it difficult. So the very first step is going to be to put the shifter in forward. And that's going to allow you to pop this button out. And then you can see inside here that you have an 11/16 bolt. Now, in order to get at that bolt to remove the shifter, you're going to have to either have a deep socket or a socket extension so you can reach in there and remove it. So there you have the bolt that goes inside and holds your shifter on, and now that will allow you to remove your shifter. Now also in here, it may come out when you remove the shifter, is this plastic sleeve, and that just slides right in and out of there. Then you have this plastic shroud here that you see has some little clip nubs here, and all you have to do is pop that out, and you pop out that retainer, and so now your shifter is removed. Now when I initially saw that, I figured, oh boy, okay, all I have to do is take out these 3 hex bolts and these 3 Phillips head screws. However, be advised, those Phillips head are not screws. They are bolts. If you go to take that out right now, you're not going to be able to. You're going to unscrew them, and they're either going to spin because of the nut behind them, or they're going to come out of the nut, and those nuts are going to fall down back behind there. These 3 hex screws hold this plate and this plate together to the housing of the shift box inside. The 3 Phillips head bolts hold the front plate, the smaller oval one, to the bigger, larger plate. Now, in order to get behind your shifter and get in there to do the work we need to do, we don't necessarily need to remove that small oval plate from the bigger plate, but just in case you need to know how to remove that, that's how they are secured. The 3 Phillips head hold the small plate to the big plate, and the 3 hex head, they hold the whole thing to the housing of the shifter box inside. Okay, all 4 out. These are the culprits, and these are the reason that you can't remove that shifter plate off without getting behind the cowling. Now, one note on these bolts, they are not the same length. They have some different lengths. The reason for that is because they have to fit through this cowling, and you'll see that the cowling is thinner here than it is up here where the front ones are. So the longer ones go here and the shorter ones go here. So when we go to reassemble, we're going to want to make sure that we put those bolts in the right holes. So with those 4 bolts out and the 5 screws out, we now have a removed shifter panel. However, you still can't really get access back there if you need to get in there. So what we'll do is we'll remove these hex bolts to release the whole panel from the box. And those hex bolts are 7/16. Take those out. Now I have those loosened up. I can just do the rest of it by hand. And once those 3 small hex bolts are out, you can see that you can now remove the shifter plate from the shifter box. And here's where those 3 hex bolts go in here. They attach right to this housing. And now that we can take this shifter plate off, you can see 1, 2, 3. Those are the nuts that hold the front plate to the back plate. So you don't necessarily have to remove this unless there's something you have to do in here or you have to replace a part there. But if you were tempted to unscrew these while this was attached, you'd have to deal with those nuts there. Finally, we have that access into this area. So you can work on a wire or a cable or something on the shifter box or whatnot. But now you have access and you're able to work, and you can pull this shifter box out and do whatever you need to do in there. And so now we're going to put her back together. So now I'm going to go ahead and line up the 7/16 hex bolts that go into the shifter box. Now when I'm putting this back on, I'm going to necessarily have to get one of them in there so it's lined up, and then you can manipulate the box and the plate into position so you can line up the other 2. And as you can see, once you have that first one in there, it kind of lines this up so you can line up the holes, and then it's going to make it easier for you to find and drive these home. Now when you put that first one in, you don't want to tighten that one all the way, because then you won't be able to move it to get these 2 into position. So I was able to get those in finger tight, and now I can tighten them down. Okay, so now we have the outer plate attached to the inside plate, and we have the plate attached to the shifter box inside. So now we're ready to reinstall the 4 bolts and the 5 screws. What I'll do is I will put the end screws in place to get this in position, and then I'll be able to put those bolts through and secure them on the other side with nuts from the top and from the bottom, just like we took them apart. I'll line that up and just get it started in there. I'll get over here to this side and do the same. And with all these screws going in the pre-existing holes, I'm pretty confident these 4 bolts will be lined up. So now we're going to go ahead and replace those 4 bolts. And those are have a 3/8 nut on them. And hopefully I can push them right through. And there we have it. And so you can see there's the bolt coming through there. I'll get the nut on the end of that. And I can get it started by the first few turns with the drill there, and now I can put a wrench on it, keep it stationary. I'll put my 3/8 wrench on that. And so that one is secured. So I'm just going to go along to all 4 bolts, put those nuts back on. We will be good to go. Okay, so we have the 5 screws, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tightened down, and we have one of the bolts secured. So now that I have this top one secured, I'm going to go ahead and secure the bottom one over here on this side. And on the bottom, I'm going to reach up with a 3/8 wrench to hold the nut in place. Okay, so we got those all in. 4 bolts, 2 screws on that side, 3 screws on that side, and we are now with the shifter plate reassembled. Now we got to put the shifter back on, and then we'll just go in reverse order and put everything back together. So I'm just going to make sure that these bolts are tightened. Now I'll go ahead and replace this shroud here, and it just pops into place with the tabs there, which will allow us to replace the shifter. And now remember, the shifter we had in forward, so we're going to put it back there so it's goes to the same orientation on the gear, on the teeth that it goes onto. And I'm going to make sure that shifter is forward. So now we're going to go inside and replace that 11/16 bolt that holds that shifter into place. And here's that bolt, and it's a little hard to get it in the hole because it's way in there. So we'll get that bolt on an extension so we can get in there and try to get that so we can get the first couple of bites on the threads there. And it looks like we got it. And you can see what that looks like in there. And so we'll just tighten that down. Okay, so we have those bolts replaced and secured in the front. So that's done. And they are secured here in the rod locker, so I'll go ahead and reinstall that rod bracket. You recall we had to take that out and it was just 2 screws. So now that we have those bolts going through the rod locker secured, now we just have to get up and re-secure that fuse block panel underneath there, and that's just 4 screws on the corner like we saw. And so that's back in place there. Now we can go ahead and reinstall that side panel. And we can just slide that into place, like so. And that was secured with 2 screws up top and 2 screws on the bottom lip here. Okay, so now that side panel is reinstalled. So this is quite a project if you in fact need to get back there for some reason. However, when you know what to do and the steps to do, the steps are actually fairly easy. It's just knowing where to go, what to do, and what to do when you get there. Well, folks, there you have it. That was not an easy job. It took me a long time to figure it out, and I had to enlist the help of one of my buddies who's infinitely more ingenuitive than I am in figuring things like this out, and I wouldn't have been able to do it without him. So we figured it out. We got that shifter off. We got that short taken care of, and you know what? We got it back together, and so far so good, it appears. We'll see when I'm out on the water. This is one of those things where I'm sure I'm not the only one who, for one reason or another, had to get this shifter plate off and get back in this area. So, if you're somebody like me and you were looking for that information, I really hope this video was a help to you, and I hope it saves you a lot of time and aggravation, because it took me a lot of time and aggravation. Thanks for being a part of Chicken Thigh Fishing. We will see you next time, and until then, stay fishing, my friends.